I opened the letter thinking it was another coupon for pizza, but instead found a one-page masterpiece of absurdity from our HOA. It claimed, in carefully typed legalese, that I owed $1 million in fines for multiple violations detrimental to the visual harmony of the community. I had to read it 3 times just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. The violations listed were priceless. Apparently, my mailbox was an inch too tall, my driveway had unauthorized gravel patterns, and my backyard shed was an unapproved structure with offensive color tones. Offensive to whom? Bees? None of it made sense, and all of it was ridiculous, but the part that truly made me choke on my coffee was the total, exactly $1 million, due in 30 days, payable to the HOA treasurer. The treasurer, of course, was Karen. Not just any Karen, but the Karen, short blonde hair, perpetually sunburned from her morning patrols, and a glare that could curdle milk. She'd been circling my property since the day I moved in, clipboard in hand like she was patrolling a war zone. The thing about Karen was that she didn't need an actual problem to start a crusade, she just needed to feel ignored. The HOA board was her personal kingdom, and I'd made the mistake of declining her invitation to one of their mandatory social mixers. From that moment I was marked. I tossed the letter onto the counter and called my neighbor Phil. He'd been here 10 years and knew all the gossip. $1 million fine? That's Karen's nuclear option, he said between chuckles. She tried it on the Millers once. They moved to Florida instead of fighting. I wasn't the Millers. I didn't scare easy. The land under my house wasn't just a patch of suburbia, it was part of a much larger piece I'd inherited from my grandfather, who had bought it long before the HOA even existed. They leased part of their amenities from the previous owners, and I hadn't bothered to tell them I was now the landlord. Honestly, I'd planned to let them keep running things as long as they stayed out of my hair. Clearly, they'd chosen the other option. Karen showed up 2 days later, right on schedule. She didn't knock, Karen didn't knock. She marched up my driveway in a neon visor and a golf shirt embroidered with the HOA logo like it was the flag of her empire. "You've received your fine notice, I presume," she said, tilting her chin like she was about to knight me. "I trust you understand the seriousness of your violations." "Absolutely," I said. "My driveway's gravel is a danger to national security, and my shed is probably causing diplomatic incidents." She didn't appreciate the humor. She went on to lecture me about property values, community standards, and the sanctity of the neighborhood's visual aesthetic, all while standing next to her own sun-faded garden gnome that looked like it had survived a small explosion. When she handed me a payment plan brochure, I asked, "Does this come with a coupon for pizza? Because that would make it worth considering." Her eyes narrowed to slits. Karen didn't like jokes, but I was just getting started. The following week, she started escalating. HOA notices appeared daily, each one more absurd than the last. I was fined for leaving my porch light on past midnight. I was fined for excessive bird activity in my yard. Apparently, feeding the finches was now a criminal offense. My trash bins were too visible from the road, even though they sat exactly where the city told me to put them. Phil told me over coffee that Karen had been bragging at the last HOA meeting about finally putting the screws to me. That was her fatal mistake. I hadn't told anyone, not even Phil, that I technically owned the land under half the HOA's amenities, including their clubhouse, pool, and tennis courts. They leased it for a token annual fee through a contract that had been quietly renewed for decades. That contract, however, had a very clear clause about good faith relations with the landlord. $1 million fine based on imaginary infractions? That didn't exactly qualify as good faith. I decided not to rush. Karen thrived on immediate reactions, so I gave her silence instead. Let her think she was winning. I let the letters pile up. I let her send her little inspection photos. I even waved when she drove past in her golf cart, glaring like a mall security guard who'd just caught a shoplifter. I waited until she scheduled the HOA's big summer kickoff party at the clubhouse, complete with banners, caterers, and a local cover band. 3 days before the event, I walked into the county records office and filed the necessary papers to terminate their lease. It was shockingly easy. By the time I walked back out, the HOA's clubhouse, pool, and courts were legally mine again, not in some petty symbolic way, but in the change the locks and put up a fence way. On the morning of the party, Karen arrived at the clubhouse to find a bright red eviction notice taped across the door. The gates to the pool were chained shut. The tennis courts had signs reading, "Private property, no trespassing." And just to make sure she got the message, I'd hired security guards to stand at every entrance. They weren't rude. They just asked everyone to leave unless they had written permission from the property owner. That property owner was me. I was sitting on my porch with a glass of lemonade when Karen came storming up the hill, clutching the eviction notice like it was a ransom letter. "You can't do this," she sputtered. "This is HOA property." I took a slow sip and handed her a copy of the lease agreement with her signature at the bottom. "You really should read what you sign, Karen," I said. "Page 3, Clause 9. Good faith relations. Your $1 million fine kind of ruined that part." She looked like she'd just swallowed a lemon whole. "We'll fight this in court," she hissed. "Please do," I said. "I could use a good laugh." She left without another word, but the party was cancelled, the band packed up, and the caterers drove off with trays of untouched shrimp cocktail. The neighborhood buzzed for days. People stopped me in the street to ask what happened. I just told them to check with the HOA. They had all the details. What they didn't know, what Karen still didn't fully grasp, was that this was only the beginning. She thought she could fine me into submission. I was about to show her that when you try to play landlord games with the actual landlord, you don't just lose. You get evicted. And I wasn't done yet. "Okay, now you can say, okay now 1,200 words in Chapter 2, and I'll continue the story." Karen didn't waste any time after the clubhouse eviction. The very next day, she rallied the board for an emergency meeting that, conveniently, I wasn't invited to. I only found out because Phil, who'd been on the HOA mailing list since before God invented email, forwarded me the agenda with a note. "She's plotting something big. Wear a helmet." The agenda had all the subtlety of a sledgehammer, items like address land ownership dispute and possible legal action against Mr. Lane. But the part that caught my attention was the last bullet point: special assessment vote. In HOA speak, that's code for, we're about to squeeze every homeowner for cash. By evening, half the neighborhood knew about the meeting. I knew Karen well enough to guess she'd try to use my hostile actions as a scare tactic to convince everyone I was a threat to property values, hoping to rally support against me. What she didn't know was that I had quietly started digging. That morning, I'd met with a real estate lawyer who specialized in HOA law, a man named Dennis, who looked like he'd been forged in a courtroom and fed case files for breakfast. Dennis barely needed an hour to dismantle the HOA's position. First, he confirmed my ownership over the clubhouse property was airtight. Second, he pointed out a buried clause in the HOA's bylaws that could end up being their undoing. If more than 50% of homeowners petitioned to dissolve the HOA, the entire thing could be shut down permanently. The kicker? Many of my neighbors hated the HOA already. They just never thought they could do anything about it. Karen's emergency meeting turned into the public spectacle I knew it would. They held it in the community park since, thanks to me, the clubhouse was now off-limit. Rows of folding chairs were set up under a pop-up tent, with Karen and the board sitting at a long table in front like they were presiding over a royal tribunal. She had her visor on again, this time paired with oversized pearls, as if dressing like a country club heiress would make her more intimidating. I stood at the back, arms folded, listening as she launched into her speech. She called me a disruptive element and a threat to the unity of our community. She waved a printout of my eviction notice in the air like it was evidence in a criminal trial. And then she unveiled her piece to resistance. the proposal for a special assessment of $2,000 per household to fund legal action against me. The reaction wasn't what she'd hoped for. Sure, a few of her loyalists nodded along, but most people looked uncomfortable. A couple whispered to each other. Then Mrs. Henderson, a sweet grandmother with a deceptively sharp tongue, stood up and asked, "Karen, why should we all pay for your feud with him?" The crowd chuckled. Karen's smile went brittle. When she opened the floor for comments, I stepped forward. "I'd like to point out," I said, keeping my tone calm, "that the HOA is spending your money to sue your landlord. Because that's what I am. And every dollar you give them is a dollar spent on a lawsuit they cannot win." A few heads turned my way. Karen's knuckles whitened on her clipboard. "Furthermore," I continued, "if anyone here is tired of constant fines, power trips, and million-dollar assessments, there's a simple solution. Dissolve the HOA. I happen to have petitions right here." I held up a folder and started walking through the crowd. People craned their necks to see. A man in the second row immediately took a pen and signed. Then another. And another. Karen tried to regain control. She banged a little gavel on the table, which was hilarious because it made her look like she was presiding over a high school debate club. "This is not an authorized motion," she barked. "It doesn't need to be," I said. "Bylaws, page 12, section 4, 50% plus 1, and it's over. You all have the power to end this circus today." I could practically feel the temperature rise under the tent. The board members exchanged nervous glances. Even some of Karen's usual allies were avoiding her eyes. By the end of the meeting, I had 32 signatures, just shy of the 50 I needed. Karen had lost the crowd, and she knew it. Her parting move was to storm off, muttering about outside agitators, like she was dealing with a political uprising instead of her neighbors with bad lawns. That night, Karen's retaliation began in earnest. My mailbox vanished, literally ripped out of the ground. The next morning, a code enforcement officer showed up at my door, citing me for unauthorized structural modifications to my porch. Someone had sent an anonymous complaint. The pattern was obvious, and I didn't have to guess who was behind it. But here's the thing about Karen: her ambition was always her downfall. She couldn't just stop at annoying me. She had to escalate until she crossed a line she couldn't walk back from. And she was about to cross it. A few days later, Phil called me in a hushed tone. "You need to see this," he said, and sent me a screenshot of a post from the HOA's private Facebook group. In it, Karen claimed I was planning to develop commercial buildings on the clubhouse property and bring in undesirable businesses that would destroy the family-friendly nature of the neighborhood. It was laughable, except she also wrote that I'd been harassing residents to sign illegal petitions and hinted she might contact the police. That was my green light. Defamation, harassment, malicious interference. Dennis practically lit up when I showed him the post. He told me we could not only dismantle the HOA but also hold Karen personally liable for damages. But I wasn't ready to drop the hammer just yet. No, I had something bigger in mind, something that would make her regret the day she ever wrote that $1 million fine. And it was going to happen in broad daylight, in front of every single person she thought she controlled. The neighborhood's annual HOA Pride Day was coming up. It was their self-congratulatory event where they gave out awards for Best Lawn and Most Compliant Resident. Yes, that's a real thing, complete with speeches from the board. And thanks to my newly regained property rights, they had to ask me for permission to host it on the clubhouse lawn. I gave it to them, on one condition. I'd be speaking to. Karen couldn't refuse without looking scared, so she agreed. What she didn't know was that I planned to use that microphone to announce the results of my petition drive. And with 3 more weeks to go, I was confident I could get every signature I needed, and then some. When Pride Day rolled around, I'd be ready. And Karen wouldn't just lose her clubhouse. She'd lose her crown. If you want, I can now jump straight into Chapter 3 and show you exactly how I took her down in front of the whole neighborhood. Pride Day dawned with the kind of perfect weather that makes people forget they hate each other. Blue sky, gentle breeze, just enough sun to make everyone wear sunglasses. I sat on my porch sipping coffee, watching the HOA volunteers set up white tents on the clubhouse lawn that, as of a few months ago, belonged entirely to me. I had approved their request to use it for the event, but not before slipping in a small clause in the agreement. The property owner reserves the right to make an address to attendees. Karen, of course, was in full command mode. She wore a wide-brimmed hat with a fake flower glued to the side, a floral blouse, and that same clip-on name badge she always wore at meetings, as though we'd forget who she was. From my vantage point, I could see her barking orders at the volunteers, rearranging the chairs by exactly half an inch, and personally inspecting the catering trays like she was the queen of sandwiches. I had spent the last 3 weeks in stealth mode, knocking on doors, chatting with neighbors, and collecting signatures. The $1 million fine had done more damage to Karen's image than anything I could have planned. Even her loyalists, people who used to defend her like she was some kind of HOA deity, had grown weary of her inspect and punish style of leadership. My petition to dissolve the HOA had spread faster than Karen's gossip. By the morning of Pride Day, I had 55 signatures. That was enough to meet the bylaw requirement and then some. When I arrived at the lawn with my folder in hand, a few people gave me knowing nods. Phil was already there, leaning against the lemonade table with a grin that said he knew exactly what was about to happen. Karen saw me and stiffened. Her eyes darted to the folder I was carrying. "Mr. Lane," she said coolly, "I trust you'll keep your comments today appropriate." "Oh, absolutely," I said. "Wouldn't dream of doing otherwise." The event kicked off with the usual nonsense, Karen giving a State of the Community speech that was really just a list of her own accomplishments, inflated to sound impressive. She announced the winners of the lawn competition, handed out framed certificates like they were Nobel Prizes, and thanked the board for maintaining the integrity of our neighborhood. Every sentence had the same undertone: "This is my empire, and you live in it." When she finally called me up to speak, she did it with the politeness of someone inviting a fox into the henhouse. "And now our property owner, Mr. Lane, would like to say a few words," she said through a smile so tight it could crack glass. I stepped up to the microphone, adjusted it, and scanned the crowd. Most people were lounging in folding chairs, sipping lemonade, waiting for the raffle. "Perfect. Good afternoon," I began. "I'll keep this short because I know the potato salad is calling your name. Over the past month, many of you have expressed concerns about how the HOA is being run. Some of you have told me about unfair fines, intrusive inspections, and decisions made without input from the people who actually live here. So I did some homework. Turns out, your bylaws give you the power to change that." I reached into my folder and pulled out the stack of signed petitions. "This," I said, holding them high, "is a petition to dissolve the HOA. It requires signatures from 50% plus one of the homeowners. We now have more than enough." The murmurs started instantly. Heads turned. People whispered to their neighbors. I caught Phil trying and failing to hide his smirk. Karen shot out of her chair like she'd been launched. "This is outrageous," she barked into the microphone, shoving me aside slightly. "This man is trying to dismantle the very organization that protects your property values." "Karen," I said calmly, taking the mic back, "what protects property values is a community people want to live in, not one run like a dictatorship." A ripple of applause went through the crowd. Karen tried to speak again, but the momentum had shifted. A man in the back shouted, "I'm tired of the constant fines." Another woman said, "I got cited for having a garden gnome." Someone else yelled, "We don't need you to tell us what color to paint our houses." I let the noise build before raising a hand for quiet. "The next step," I said, "is simple. We submit this petition, and the HOA is dissolved. The board disbands, the fines stop, and this community goes back to being just that, a community. Your homes stay yours. Your yards stay yours. And we stop wasting money on legal fights no one asked for. Karen was visibly shaking now, though whether it was from rage or fear, I couldn't tell. She grabbed her clipboard like it was a life raft. "You can't do this," she said, voice tight. "We have procedures." "Already followed them," I interrupted. Clause 4, Section 9. "I know you've read it. Probably more than once." Someone in the crowd shouted, "Let him finish!" And that was it. Karen's control shattered. She sat back down hard, jaw clenched, while I wrapped up. I ended by thanking everyone for their time and telling them I'd keep them posted on the dissolution process. When I stepped down, at least a third of the people there came up to shake my hand or pat me on the back. Karen stayed rooted in her seat, clutching her clipboard like it could stop the inevitable. But Karen wasn't done fighting. Later that afternoon, Phil called to tell me she'd been going door to door, trying to convince people to withdraw their signatures. She told them without the HOA, the neighborhood would descend into chaos, and strangers would move in with 30 cats. One woman even said Karen tried to bribe her with a year of waived dues. Her desperation only made her look worse. Within 48 hours, I had gained another 6 signatures from people who'd been on the fence. At that point, we were way past the threshold. The official submission to dissolve the HOA went in the next week. Karen tried to file an injunction to block it, but Dennis handled that in a single afternoon, walking into the courthouse with a binder full of documentation and walking out with her motion denied. 2 weeks later, the vote was certified. The HOA was officially dissolved. No more fines. No more mandatory meetings. No more Karen in a visor telling people their fence slats were non-compliant. The day the results came in, I sat on my porch again, coffee in hand, watching Karen drive past in her golf cart. She didn't wave. She didn't glare. She just stared straight ahead, the wind from her cart flapping the corner of the "For Sale" sign on her lawn. The Queen had lost her crown. And I had one more move left. One that would make sure she never tried to rebuild her little empire here again. When the HOA officially dissolved, most people thought that was the end of it. They imagined Karen would pack up her clipboard and visor, sell her house, and vanish into another unsuspecting neighborhood where she could start over fresh. But I knew Karen better than that. She wasn't the type to go quietly. She was the type to linger, to scheme, to look for a way back into power like a dethroned monarch plotting in exile. I started seeing the signs right away. The first clue was a flyer slipped under my door 2 days after the dissolution vote. It was printed on cheap neon paper and read, "Join the Neighborhood Alliance, a new, voluntary organization dedicated to preserving our community's standards." No mention of Karen's name, but the writing style was unmistakable. I'd been reading her passive-aggressive prose for months, overuse of capital letters, unnecessary quotation marks, and that vague, menacing undertone that managed to make community pride sound like a threat. The second clue came from Phil, who'd spotted Karen holding a casual meeting in her driveway with 5 or 6 of her old HOA loyalists. They were leaning over a folding table covered with maps of the neighborhood, legal pads, and coffee cup. Phil swore he heard her say, "If we do this right, we can get control again." That was all I needed to hear. I wasn't going to let her start a shadow HOA and drag everyone back into the mess we'd just escaped from. But I also knew that going after her directly would just feed her martyr complex. If I wanted to end this for good, I had to make it clear, not just to Karen, but to the entire neighborhood, that any attempt to reinstate her power would be a lost cause before it even began. That's when I remembered something my grandfather once told me about the land. When he'd bought it decades ago, he had been meticulous about the property lines and the easements. Some of those easements, like the one that gave the HOA access to their amenities, were now in my hands. But there was another easement I hadn't thought about much until now. The one that gave me control over all community signage, bulletin boards, and public announcement areas in the neighborhood. Back when the HOA existed, this clause had been buried under a mountain of amendments, but with them gone, the original terms were active again. which meant that if anyone wanted to put up flyers, banners, or notices anywhere in the neighborhood's public spaces, they needed my permission. And if I didn't grant it? Down the sign came. I called Dennis, my lawyer, to confirm. He practically chuckled through the phone. "You're telling me you have exclusive rights over all the neighborhood's posting areas? That's gold," he said. "If she's trying to rebuild, you can shut her down before she gets her first meeting off the ground." Perfect. 2 days later, I caught Karen in the act. She was taping up a bright orange Neighborhood Alliance meeting notice on the bulletin board by the park entrance. She froze when she saw me walking up. "Oh, hello, Mr. Lane," she said, tone dripping with faux sweetness. "Just posting a little invite for our neighbors to come together for the greater good." I glanced at the flyer. It was scheduled for the following Saturday at, surprise, surprise, her house. "Karen," I said, "did you get permission to post this?" Her eyes narrowed. "Permission? From whom?" "From me," I said, pulling a folded copy of the easement from my back pocket. Section 2, Paragraph 5. The property owner, me, has final approval over all public signage in the neighborhood. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "Maybe," I said, "but it's also legal." I took the flyer down and handed it back to her. "You're free to invite people privately, but no public postings without approval. That's the rule." She stormed off without another word, but I knew that wouldn't be the last I'd hear of it. Sure enough, the next day, Phil texted me a picture of a new flyer taped to the community mailbox cluster. This one didn't mention her name at all, but it had the same design and language. I took it down. Then she started getting creative, slipping invitations into people's mail slots, tucking them under doormats, even leaving them inside free newspaper boxes at the corner. I didn't stop her from doing those, they were technically private, but I quietly made sure to visit as many houses as possible in the days leading up to her meeting, reminding everyone what had happened with the HOA and encouraging them to think twice before letting it rise from the dead. Saturday came, and I decided to take a little stroll past Karen's house about 30 minutes into her Neighborhood Alliance meeting. I half expected to see a small crowd gathered in her driveway, sipping lemonade and plotting my downfall. Instead, I saw 3 people sitting in folding chairs looking bored, and one of them was her husband. The rest of the chairs were empty. Karen spotted me immediately and gave me the kind of glare that could melt steel. I smiled, waved, and kept walking. But I wasn't done. The following week, I hosted a community cookout on the clubhouse lawn. With the HOA gone, I didn't need to ask permission, and I made sure to invite everyone. Free barbecue, live music, bounce house for the kids. The works. And while the food was great and the music lively, the real star of the event was the giant banner I hung over the main tent. It read, "Our neighborhood, free and independent since 2023. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. People laughed, took pictures, and asked if I'd be making the cookout an annual thing. By the end of the day, I'd cemented the idea that this was now our community. Open, relaxed, and, most importantly, Karen-free. Karen didn't try to post another flyer after that. She still drove her golf cart around like a self-appointed patrol officer, but her influence was gone. Without the authority of the HOA behind her, she was just another resident with too much free time and a bad attitude. Still, I knew there was one more thing I needed to do to make sure she never clawed her way back into power: secure the land. I arranged with Dennis to file an updated covenant that permanently prohibited any formal homeowners association from being formed on my property or any parcels connected to it. It passed without issue. Now, even if Karen somehow convinced a majority to reinstate the HOA, the legal framework wouldn't allow it. When the paperwork came back finalized, I made copies and slipped them into every neighbor's mailbox, along with a short note: "The HOA is gone. Permanently. Enjoy your freedom." A few days later, as I was taking out the trash, Karen stopped at the end of my driveway. She didn't say anything at first, just sat there in her golf cart, staring at me. Finally, she said, "You think you've won?" I shrugged. "No, Karen. We all did." She didn't reply. Just drove off, slower than usual, visor tilted low over her eyes. The truth was, this wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about making sure no one in this neighborhood would ever have to live under the thumb of a petty tyrant again. And while Karen might still fume and plot, she now had no battlefield to fight on. But as satisfying as that was, I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd try one last desperate move before the "for sale" sign on her lawn turned into a moving truck. And when she did, I'd be ready to finish this once and for all. Karen's last stand began with a rumor. Phil caught wind of it first. Apparently, she'd been telling a select group of neighbors that she had one last trick to force me into selling the clubhouse land back to the community. The way she told it, she had friends in the county offices and could get zoning changed overnight. It was classic Karen bravado, half bluff, half delusion, but I'd learned the hard way that underestimating her was dangerous. 3 days later, I saw her plan start to take shape. A community preservation petition appeared in a few front windows, complete with the county seal printed at the top. At first glance, it looked official. The language claimed it was an effort to protect community assets from privatization, and called for the county to review the zoning and usage of the clubhouse property. In short, if she got enough signatures, she could push for the land to be designated as a public amenity, which would give the county leverage over how it was used, maybe even force a buyback. It was clever. Desperate, but clever. I brought the flyer straight to Dennis. He examined it, then laughed, a sharp, dry sound. "This thing's full of holes," he said. "She's misusing the county seal, which is a big no-no. And this petition? Completely toothless. Even if she got every single homeowner to sign, zoning changes like this go through a long, public process. She's bluffing to scare you." "Maybe so," I said, "but if she scares enough people, she'll get momentum. And once momentum builds, it doesn't matter how flimsy the plan is. People follow it because they think it's a lifeline." Dennis leaned back in his chair. "Then you don't just stop her. You turn it against her." That's when we came up with the counterstrike. The next morning, I drafted a letter to the entire neighborhood. It explained, in plain language, that Karen's petition was legally meaningless, that misusing the county seal could be considered fraud, and that any zoning change would require years of hearings and legal review. I attached a signed statement from a county zoning official confirming all of it, and, just for good measure, I included a copy of the covenant I'd filed that permanently prohibited any HOA from forming here again. Then I hosted a coffee with the landlord event at the clubhouse lawn, same spot where I'd humiliated her on Pride Day. People came with mugs and folding chairs, expecting a low-key meet and greet. Instead, they got the full story of Karen's latest maneuver. I passed out copies of her fake petition and my official documentation side by side. "Now," I said, holding them up, "you can see the difference between something real and something that looks official but isn't." The crowd laughed. Some rolled their eyes. Phil called out, "Next thing you know, she'll be fining us for breathing too loud." I didn't even have to ask them to act. Neighbors started taking down her flyers themselves. By the end of the day, the petition had been ripped out of every window except hers. That's when Karen made her final mistake. She filed a complaint against me with the county, accusing me of harassment and illegal property use. She claimed I had locked residents out of public amenities, translation, my own property, and had intimidated residents into signing away their rights. I was notified of the complaint on a Tuesday. By Friday, I was sitting in a conference room at the county offices with Dennis, a stack of documents, and a very tired-looking compliance officer. Karen was there too, sitting rigid in a bright red blazer, papers clutched in both hands. The officer let her speak first. She launched into a speech about community betrayal, abuse of power, and the moral duty of property owners to serve the greater good. She handed over her fake petition as if it were a smoking gun. When it was my turn, I slid my binder across the table. Inside was every piece of documentation proving my ownership, the covenant banning any future HOA, and the county statement debunking her petition. I also included half a dozen written testimonies from neighbors who said they'd been misled or pressured by Karen to sign her forms. The compliance officer leafed through it all in silence. Then he looked at Karen and said, "Mrs. Douglas, you are in violation of County Code 9.42 regarding unauthorized use of government seals. Additionally, your complaint lacks any legal basis." Karen blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means," the officer said flatly, "that your petition is null, your accusations are unfounded, and you are formally warned to cease misrepresenting county authority. Failure to do so could result in fines or legal action against you." It was the first time I'd ever seen her speechless. She gathered her papers with shaky hands and left without another word. But I wasn't done. 2 weeks later, I closed the loop for good. I bought Karen's mortgage. It wasn't as outrageous as it sounded. Turns out, her lender had bundled her loan into a portfolio that was up for sale, and with Dennis's help, I tracked it down and made the purchase. I didn't even have to overpay. When the paperwork cleared, I became not just her neighbor and former HOA landlord, but also her literal mortgage holder. I didn't evict her. That would have been too easy, and too quick. Instead, I sent her a polite letter, informing her that her payments were now due directly to me, and that late payments would be subject to the standard penalties outlined in her contract. She made exactly 3 months of on-time payments before putting her house up for sale. The day the moving truck arrived, I watched from my porch as she loaded her golf cart onto a trailer. She never looked my way. By evening, she was gone. The neighborhood felt lighter almost instantly. People started planting gardens, painting their houses, putting out yard art without fear of a citation. Kids played in the street without Karen's golf cart creeping behind them like a slow-motion police chase. A week later, I hosted another cookout, this one not to prove a point, but to celebrate. No speeches, no banners, just good food, music, and laughter. Phil raised a beer in my direction and said, "To the end of an era." I clinked my bottle against his. "And the beginning of a better one." Karen was never heard from again, not in this town anyway. But every time I see a clipboard, I can't help but smile, knowing that the next HOA that crosses her path will have no idea what's coming. And if they call me for advice, I'll tell them the truth. The best way to beat a Karen is to own the ground she's standing on.